which leads us then to the great debates between the two political philosophies of more government or less government, which involve the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now you'll notice when you come to this slide, there's an awful lot on it, and there has to be. I'd wrestled with how to present this to you and for you, and there's no other way, whether you've had the AP class and have really mastered it or not, there's no other way for me to do this other than to really lay it out like this for you, because this is so important to the political thinking of the United States and the political establishment of the U.S. during this time. These two groups, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, had different ideas about what kind of country we should be. And we'll start with the Federalists on this first slide here. You'll notice that they're a group of people that think, okay, we've tried this model where we've set up a government that deliberately couldn't do things that governments ought to be able to do. We've tried that for 9 years and it really hasn't worked. And so we need to establish a government to protect our liberties, because too much freedom is as bad as not enough. You still get you get chaos on either end. You get chaos or repression. Chaos is just as bad as the repression. So from the Federalist point of view, government power was a friend. It could be used to protect the masses from an individual who wanted to be tyrannical if you set the government up in the right way. And you'll notice there are key beliefs here. They believed in a certain amount of deference. Higher class people who had a stake in society, property holders, the wealthy, the elites, the educated, they should sort of, call some of the shots. As such, they were more supported by Yankee New Englanders, who tended to be people that gravitated towards this commercial model. This is the pro-Constitution group. It's very important for you to understand the Federalists supported the Constitution wholeheartedly. They were all for property rights and all for a central government that could extend its power over time. And this would be a so-called loose constructionism. In other words, a broad interpretation of government powers through the Constitution. Allow the government to grow and expand as the nation grows and expands and deals with new issues. And so, in the sense of realpolitik, the Federalists said it made sense to deal with the English because they are the world's dominant sea power, and from a commercial point of view and a political military point of view, particularly their colony Canada on our northern border, it makes sense for us to make nice with them. And they saw government's main purpose as to help extend the role of commerce and business within the nation, which would bring in prosperity and economic strength in the nation, which is going to make the nation strong overall. The Anti-Federalists, on your next slide, very different conception of things. The Anti-Federalists said, Articles of Confederation, they weren't that bad. They had some problems and all, but government power will be the undoing of us all. And they were terrified of government power. In many ways, they represented far more of the population than the Federalists did. Most Americans in this rural society were farmers. It was an agrarian world. And they thought that the farmers and the lower classes, the middle classes, ought to rule. After all, they'd earned this right through fighting in the Revolution. They believed when that line said all men are created equal in the Declaration, it meant all men were created equal. No one of special privilege should have special political privilege. They preferred the Articles of Confederation. They said they might not be great, but once you give up too much power to a government, you're never going to get that back, so it's better safe than sorry. They wanted individual rights guaranteed, no more tyranny of a powerful government or a minority or a majority oppressing the individual on their own basis. They believe in what we call strict constructionism. It's the opposite of loose constructionism. In other words, if it's not written down in the Constitution, in ink, the government should not be able to expand into those powers. Whatever's not written down, keep it in the people, keep it in the states, keep government like a genie tightly screwed down in a bottle. Don't let it out of that box. Don't let it out of that bottle, because once it gets out, you can't ever put it back in, and they were terrified of that. And they don't want government intervention in the economy, because the Anti-Federalists felt that's going to pick winners and losers. If the government supports creditors, well, the debtor class is going to get a whole lot of nothing out of that. The government supports merchants. Well, the farmers are going to get a whole lot of nothing out of that. And so they had real concerns about heading down that road. Now, when it comes to the arguments for ratification, as you know, because you live in this world that we live in today, the Constitution is the law of the land. The Constitution is our governing document. Well, if most Americans were not of the elite classes, most Americans were not in favor of the Constitution, how did it ever get passed? Well, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the fact that the articles clearly didn't work, and most Americans saw that. And if you had this document, you could standardize the money supply, you could reduce taxes, you could repay the war debt on somewhat of a, in the war bonds that were owed to American citizens on somewhat of a rationalized schedule. Whereas even though there's no Bill of Rights, the Federalists promised to put one in, And if you don't move beyond the Articles, even if the Articles weren't effective, if you don't move beyond them, then we don't have a nation state that's going to be worth keeping. There won't be anything to keep. So as such, the Federalist Papers were established to essentially make the argument that a strong government, a big strong government, a big strong nation is actually a better guarantor of your liberty than a small government of a small nation or a series of small nations where various self-interested minorities could then sort of overrun people and take people's rights away on a pick and choose basis. That was the argument of the Federalist Papers, and the Federalists were outstanding salespeople. They were outstanding salesmen. They made this argument for ratification and made an effective case that despite the fears of the pro-Articles people about this being a conspiracy leading to tyranny, and the fact that this change was illegal because the Articles Convention was never called for to destroy the Articles and come with a new government, the Federalists were realists. Despite the anti-federalist fears and bellowing, it was pretty much obvious to everyone that the Articles weren't working. And the Federalists really turned on the pitch. They made the sale. And in general, the large planters were inclined to agree with it. Businessmen, urban types, artisans, laborers, they were kind of agree with it because it's the kind of government that can establish trade. Trade's going to get people jobs. The merchants and businessmen in general, they're going to want it. It's going to create stability, and stability is good for a business environment. The rest of the country, not really in favor, but the rest of the country was persuaded by the strength of these arguments. And so we moved then into this new constitutional period. Setting up the machinery of government is one thing. Seeing that machinery actually start to turn into operation, well, that's going to be a story then for lesson 10. Where do we go from here? And that'll be where we take you in our next lesson, the Constitution in practice.